Assalamualaikum Pak Awan.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi
Masih
Prof.
nunggu
Martadha belum?
Belum Pak, tapi sudah saya infokan kalau Zoom-nya started.
Oke.
Pak Awang and also student. Right now, Prof. Marta finds technical issues in joining the Zoom meeting, but he will be here 5 minutes left. 5 minutes again.
Okay. Assalamualaikum, Prof.
Waalaikumsalam. Ya, Pak.
Yay.
Sorry, some technical issue.
Okay. Mbak Adiba,
Ya,
Mbak
Pak Wang.
Prof. Martadha already here. Mbak Adiba, can you start? Mbak Adiba?
Yeah, yes. I forgot to unmute my microphone. So, Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam
Salam.
warahmatullahi.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's already 11. We are now we are going to have another session, our last session of visiting professor program, which is for course Introduction to Government and Political Science atau dasar-dasar ilmu pemerintah, politik dan pemerintahan, which is Pak Awang as the main lecturer for this session, for this lecture. But in this session, we are going to learn more about the risk management in governance sector. So we are going to compare everything regarding the risk management held in Malaysia, and we can also compare it with Indonesia. So feel free to ask a lot of questions in this session, and I hope everything will run smoothly. So without further ado, I will give this session to Pak Awang as the moderator. Pak Awang, the time is yours.
Okay, thank you Mbak Adiba. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Okay, good afternoon everybody, and also on behalf of IGOV, I would say thank you very much for Prof. Martadha. Students, this is the second occasion of visiting professor by Prof. Martadha. If you still remember, last month we got also visiting professor from Prof. Martadha, and today we will run about risk management government. So Prof. Martadha will teach us how government should manage the risk that faced by the governments. Several risks might be faced by the government, and we will learn how to solve, or how to solve the risks that faced by the governments. Prof. Martadha, 45 minutes enough for the presentations, and then will be followed by question and also answer sessions. Okay, please, Prof. Martadha, time is yours.
Okay, thank you Pak Wang. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
And good morning to all of you. Okay, let me start. Okay, by showing you whenever we are talking about risk management or risk governance, now we have to talk about disaster management, because risk management is related to disaster management. Can you see the slide?
Yes.
Yes, Prof.
Okay. Okay. So now let us talk about applying the minimum standard to ensure disaster risk reduction. Or, you might come across this word more often when you read disaster management or risk management, disaster risk reduction, DRI, through education. This is very important because a lot of countries now are facing crisis, not only pandemic, but also natural disaster crisis, tsunami, flood. Even in Malaysia, a couple of days ago, Kuala Lumpur, Shah Alam, and a few states, they are having severe flooding problem, causing a lot of damage, a lot of people who died because of that. So this is very critical for a lot of countries, and especially for students. You have to be able to understand how to face the crisis, how to manage the crisis, and how to, if you were given the opportunities to administer the crisis, you should have a lot of information and knowledge when it comes to managing the crisis or managing the disaster. So let us talk about how important it is to have this kind of knowledge and education to minimize the risk of disaster. So, this slide is based upon the slide of Interagency Network for Education in Emergencies, where they have come across a lot of organizations to discuss and to set up minimum standard for a lot of countries whenever countries are facing with disaster. So be familiar with minimum standards. So these are the minimum standards, the process and product, and able to adapt them to a particular context to ensure holistic quality education through risk management cycle. So this is risk management cycle: response, recovery, preparedness, mitigation, and prevention. So I'll be talking about the risk management cycle here. Starting with response to crisis, and then how to recover, in terms of preparedness, in terms of how to mitigate or lessen the crisis, and how to prevent the crisis or the disaster in the future. So these are the things that we will be talking about: risk management cycle. Have an awareness of new education and risk reduction tools and relevant initiative in the region and globally that you can link or you can build upon to strengthen your existing work. If you probably are in the line of disaster management, so you should have this kind of tool to help you in your work. Make linkages across education and risk reduction program in the region, learn lessons from experiences of others, and incorporate those lessons, good practices in your work. So I'll be talking about risk management concepts and then apply this minimum standard to build back better. So these are the cycle that I talk about: prevention, mitigation, preparedness, and response. And then go into further detail about ensuring risk reduction through education by utilizing tools and enhancing plans for schools, policy and coordination, community participation, intersectoral and cross-cutting linkages, and applying the knowledge and good practices and lesson learned to individual and national action plan in order to strengthen existing work. So let's look at risk management concepts and what we can learn from situation over the world. So hopefully you will understand better the key concepts of disaster management and be able to explain what is meant by difference between disaster preparedness, mitigation, prevention, and response. And how these concepts in relation to education and how vulnerability and capacity impacts upon education at your level, at the community, and at the national level. So what is hazard? What is a disaster? How are they different? So we can look at, this last time tsunami and tropical storm. Now is the time a lot of countries, especially in Southeast Asian countries, now we are facing tropical storm. Philippines has just had tropical storm, tornadoes, and then hurricanes, and we also, are impacted by the hurricane and also storms. So what is a natural hazard versus a disaster? A natural hazard is a natural phenomenon that potentially trigger a disaster. So this include earthquake, mudslides, floods, volcanic eruption, like in Indonesia, tsunamis, drought. So these are all natural hazards that can cause a lot of disasters. This physical event need not necessarily result in disaster. Sometimes you look at Japan, for example, a classic case where a lot of earthquakes take place in Japan. But if you were to look at the disaster or the impact of that earthquake, there are a lot less fatalities and losses in Japan compared to other countries. And why? Because they always prepare beforehand. They always have a good preparation before any volcanic eruption or any tsunamis or any earthquake. So that's why even if these are natural hazards, but they don't necessarily result in disaster. So those are the difference between natural hazard versus a disaster. A disaster is a serious disruption of the functioning of a community or a society involving widespread human, material, economic, or environmental losses and impacts, exceeding the ability of the community to cope using own resources. So you look at the tsunami experiences last time in Aceh, in India, in Malaysia, and a few Thailand, also in a few other countries where it was a serious disaster. And why? Because exceeding the ability of the community to cope using own resources. So that's why a lot of countries came to help, not only in Aceh, but also in Thailand and also in other countries. And also you look at earthquake in Haiti, for example, where a lot of countries also came to help. In Philippines, for example, also a lot of countries came to help Philippines. And this is called a disaster, where the situation caused the government to pull all its resources to manage the crisis to the extent that sometimes the country alone cannot cope with the crisis. It requires also the help from other countries. So this is what we call a disaster, which is different from a natural hazard. So what is risk? The product of hazards over which we have no control. So that's what the definition of risk. It combines the likelihood or probability of a disaster happening. So there is a risk of a disaster, whether in terms of serious disaster or whether the disaster is a small scale disaster. But the probability of a disaster taking place is there. So that's what we call risk. The negative effects that result if the disaster happens. And these are increased by vulnerabilities, characteristics or circumstances that make one susceptible to damaging effects of a hazard, and decreased by capacities, combination of strength, attitude, and resources. So our own capacity to manage the crisis is also part of the definition of risk. So you combine with vulnerabilities and you combine with our own lesser capacities to face the crisis. So that's what we say it is risk. There is risk involved in every natural hazard that is taking place in every part of the world. And what are other important terminologies? Prevention, outright avoidance of the adverse effects of hazard or disaster. So we can, if we prepare early, we can prevent any kind of disaster. Mitigation, the process of lessening or limiting the adverse effects of hazards or disasters. Preparedness, knowledge and capacities to effectively anticipate, respond to, and recover from impacts of likely hazard. Risk reduction, practice of reducing risk through systematic efforts to analyze and manage the causal factors of disasters, including through reduced exposure, lessen vulnerability, and improve preparedness. And response, provision of emergency services to save life, meet needs. So these are the key concepts in terms of risk management. So you can see sometime in the literature, if you were to read a lot of literature, there have been a lot of abundance literature on the preparedness to disaster management, which is very important, preparedness. And then mitigation, prevention, and response, risk reduction. These are all important concepts in risk management. So appropriate disaster prevention, mitigation, preparedness, and response builds on people's capacities and tackles the causes of vulnerability. So that's why it is important to learn, to study about disaster management so that we can prevent, mitigate, or even prepare in terms of building our own capacities and lessening the issue of vulnerability. You look at, again, Japan, for example. Japan is a country that is continuously facing a lot of natural disasters, a lot of natural hazards. Earthquake, tsunami, typhoon, tropical storm, so many natural disasters, so many natural hazards. But the country is able to lessen and mitigate the risk of disaster because they take serious action in terms of preparing, making preparedness in terms of facing and preparing the natural disaster. So that's why they are able to reduce the loss of people, the loss of damages in the country, because they are continuously facing a lot of natural hazards in their own country. How do the concepts of vulnerability and capacity apply to us to help us understand the concept of risk management or disaster management? Within education system, what kind of vulnerability typically exists? What capacities exist that could enable education to continue with minimum disruption? A lot of Western countries, they also face a lot of disasters, but they are able to minimize that, to minimize the disruption, compared to developing countries. You look at Haiti, for example, the whole country collapsed. You look at Philippines, the same. You look at India, it is the same thing. You look at Thailand, it is also the same thing. Malaysia, Indonesia. No, we are all unable to reduce the minimum disruption that is caused by these natural hazards that cause natural disasters. So it is important for education, for knowledge to be imparted, especially to people, so that they are able to make necessary preparedness before any natural disaster take place. So how can education be used as a vehicle to increase capacities to reduce vulnerability to disaster. And you look at case studies from the region. So INEE have started to improve the minimum standard and try to use the minimum standard to help countries that are facing natural disasters on how to manage and prepare natural disaster in their own country. So education, no, this kind of information and education is critical because it can be life-saving and it can also be life-sustaining during disasters. Education is a right even in an emergency and a key to life with dignity. Education is what children, parents ask for during disasters. Quality, relevant education contributes to development, growth, peace, stability, and good governance. So this center, they started off with a project called the Sphere Project in 1997 to address concerns of quality and accountability in humanitarian responses. So they emphasize the right to life with dignity. Minimum standard. So these are the minimum standards that are critical. Water, sanitation, hygiene, food security, nutrition, food aid, shelter, settlement, and non-food items, health services. These are the minimum standards in terms of disaster response, because clean water is very necessary. Sanitation is also important, you know, because when it comes time to disaster, these are the things that people always have trouble with. You know, I just read in Malaysia, you know, in KL, there are some areas they are still facing problems of clean water, problem of sanitation, and hygienic hygienic issues in terms of food, in terms of living condition. So these are the things that are very critical after the disaster. And then food security, you know, having access to nutritious food, you know, having access to food. So these are also critical, and providing shelter, settlement, and non-food item, and also health services. So these are the minimum standards that are required for every country to prepare and provide whenever they are dealing with or facing the crisis. And how did this agency prepare the minimum standard? No, they get together with a lot of organization, with a lot of people, consultation, local, national, sub-regional, regional consultation to prepare the minimum standards for every country. So content represent rights, global practice, lesson learned, and actors for safe quality education. So there are standards and there are indicators and also guidance notes that can help countries in terms of preparing the disaster. So these are community participation, you know, education, coordination, implementation achievement. There have been a lot of countries that are able to apply this standard when they are facing disaster. For example, Uganda, Darfur, Pakistan. So let's look at some of the case studies. Philippines, you know, coordination like by the Ministry of Education, UNICEF, Save the Children Plan, Philippine civil society groups, and other partners for prevention, mitigation, preparedness, and holistic response. Aceh in Indonesia, building back better after the tsunami, enhancing resilience through response that includes mitigation and preparedness after thorough assessment. So now what they did was they provide questionnaires, they ask for feedbacks, you know, in Uganda, Darfur, Pakistan. So now people who have experienced this, disaster and come across this training, they are well aware, have a clear understanding of interconnectedness of standard, enforcing holistic response to emergency and laid groundwork for recovery. So this is important, laid groundwork for recovery, because sometimes the recovery process takes a long time. But if they have the minimum standard, then it would help the authorities in every specific country to deal with the recovery process. So the minimum standards, level of quality, access and provision, and then also part of legal requirement. So these minimum standards are used in over 80 countries in the world for a common starting points in terms of these are the things: enhance holistic quality program and policy, improve response coordination, enhance accountability and predictability, strengthen resilience and preparedness, tool to bridge the gap between phases of relief and recovery, promote as essential component of disaster response through to recover. So these are examples. So adoption strategy checklist for UN agencies, NGO, government, donors, interagency collaboration. So this checklist help a lot of agencies, a lot of countries, and a lot of actors in terms of preparing for disaster. Okay, so let's look at others. Let's look at capacity building in disaster management, the way forward. So disaster management, I talk about some key concept in risk management. So now let us talk about disaster management. Paradigm shift, relief-centric approach to a proactive regime. So a holistic and integrated approach, because when it comes to disaster management, a lot of time governments are unable to apply a proactive approach. What they do is that normally they try to control everything from the headquarters. So that's the wrong thing to do. When you try to command everything from the headquarters, sometimes you are unable to understand what is taking place on the ground, especially if the disaster is taking place far away from the national headquarters. So this is something that a lot of organizations, especially United Nations, they have been trying to make sure that a lot of countries, whenever they try to approach disaster management, they have to take a proactive approach, rather than a centric approach. And this is what we call a holistic and integrated approach, where building strategic partnership at various levels, preparedness and capacity development in all spheres, consolidation of past initiative and learn from best practices, identification, assessment, and monitoring of disaster risk, build disaster resilient structure and habitat for ensuring safer living. So this is important, build disaster resilient structure. So when it comes time to facing disaster, countries, they are able to manage the crisis because they already have these disaster resilient structures in place to help them to face the disaster. So let's look at disaster management cycle, disaster impact, respond, recovery, development, mitigation, preparedness. So if this is followed closely, then countries are able to reduce the impact of the disaster. So what is important and critical when it comes time to disaster management approach is to promote a culture of prevention. So this is very critical. So that's why we always say prevention is better than cure. Now, if we take steps and initiative to prevent disaster from taking place, then it should be good for any country, so that we will not incur a lot of losses, because we are able to take preparedness, we are able to improve the situation, making necessary preparation before any disaster is taking place. So that's why promoting a culture of prevention is always the best approach in disaster management. And the approach is multi-level, multi-sectoral, multi-discipline synergy. Disaster management related skills to all stakeholders, top-down and bottom-up approach. So pre-disaster, what should take place? Prevention, preparedness, mitigation. So the reason why some countries are able to successfully reduce the mortalities, reduce the losses because of the pre-disaster planning. They try to make sure that the country is prepared. They try to make sure a lot of initiatives are taken to prevent the severe loss, to mitigate and lessen the loss or lessen the disaster. And during disaster, the response. What kind of response is there? A lot of time, if you read cases in a lot of countries, when countries were facing with disaster because of response. The reason why a lot of people died during disaster because of slow response. And if you were to read the flood situation in New Orleans, in America at one time, because if you were to look at New Orleans is one of the state in America. The state is basically, or the city is basically located under the sea level. So they have to build, some kind of like in Jakarta. The reason why the country, your government is moving the capital city from Jakarta to Kalimantan is because of Jakarta is basically under the sea level. So you have to build levee, they called it levee, to prevent water from coming into the city, from coming into the area. So that is also what was taking place in New Orleans. The government built a lot of levee to prevent water from coming. But when there was storm, when there was tornado, the water level was increasing, and the levee was unable to stop water from coming into. So what happened was the whole city was being submerged by water because the levee was breaking apart. And the situation is also very serious in Jakarta. A lot of people are predicting that if something is not being done to move people away from the city of Jakarta, so the situation might also take place in Jakarta, because the area near the sea is lowered in terms of water level. So that's why there is a serious threat of flood in Jakarta if something is not being done urgently. So I think the reason why, apart from Jakarta is also busy, congested, so many population. Apart from that is because of the crisis of flood that will take place if something is not done as soon as possible. So that's what we call pre-disaster management. And during disaster, like I said, the reason why so many people died because of slow response. And why slow response? because of lack of prevention, lack of preparedness, lack of mitigation. So that's why a lot of people die during the disaster because of slow response. And the situation was also similar that took place in New Orleans, where the blame was being put on the mayor of New Orleans because he was trying to take in charge of the situation, but he did not know how to handle the crisis. So the crisis worsened to the extent that the federal government had to replace him with someone who knows how to manage the crisis, and the person after that was able to reduce and mitigate the crisis. So it was important at that time that the right person who has the necessary knowledge. So that's why I started off with the education. You have to have education about risk management. You have to have knowledge about disaster management before you can take charge in terms of preparing, in terms of preventing and mitigating the disaster. And post-disaster is also something which is very, very critical. So especially in terms of rehabilitation, reconstruction, you can see Aceh, for example, it took a long time to rebuild the communities, to rebuild the structure. No, it's not the government and other agencies that came to help the government of Aceh, to rebuild houses, to rebuild facilities. It took quite some time before Aceh became like what it is now, and develop in terms of again economic development, physical development. So all of these things, they really take a long time in order to ensure that everything can get back to normal. So these three phases of disaster management is very critical for a lot of countries. So the existing scenario, frequency and intensity of disasters and impact increase the risk of mortality, increase the risk of losses, increase the risk of potential death in the country. So poverty, population density, and growth. So just look at what happened if the disaster takes place in an area where population density is very high. I'm sure the death toll might be increasing, compared to areas that do not have a lot of people in that particular area. So again, that's the scenario that we have to think about. Urbanization, migration, more habitation in disaster-prone areas. So that's why, Aceh last time full of people. Phuket, it was full of people. Population density is very, very high. And then the migration, a lot of people are moving to stay in Phuket at that particular time. So the death toll was quite significant. And apart from that, it was also a tourist destination. So same thing with Palu, same thing with Aceh, same thing with Sri Lanka. That's why the death toll was very, very high, because this area was full of migration, was full of urbanization. And post-disaster approach, whether what we do is on ad hoc basis or relief-oriented, becoming reactive, rather than proactive. Resources allocated for immediate and post-disaster activities. So this is important. Lack of education, lack of awareness, and lack of capacity at all levels, not only federal level, but also state and local level. How prepared the local level in terms of facing the disaster? How prepared the regional government in terms of facing the disasters? Last time when we were, in some states, when the states were facing severe flooding problem, there was quite a number of cases where the boats that were supposed to help the people, but the boats were not working properly. Why? because the boats were there just like that. No, they did not even try to move around the boat. They did not even try to make sure the boat is in a working condition. And suddenly the flood took place and they tried to use the boat, but they cannot do that because the boats were all in bad conditions. So just imagine. So these are the issues that a lot of government, they have to be prepared, especially local government. In the reason why in Shah Alam, a few days ago, if you happen to read in news about Malaysia, in Shah Alam, the disaster was quite significant. A lot of cars were being submerged. A lot of people, water level rose until, basically so high that people had to climb up the roof to help, to make sure that they can run away from the flood. So why the loss was very severe? Because people over there, local government over there, they did not prepare. They did not anticipate that the disaster is going to take place in their own area. Because sometimes all these disasters are caused by human actions. They cut off trees, they throw out rubbish in the river, so the river gets stuck, and then when the flow of water is not smooth, the water will then be channeled into areas, low areas, where a lot of people are living. So that's why the loss was very severe in this particular area, because local government was not prepared to face that kind of disaster. So that's why, if we were to look at that, that's the reason why Japan, even though they continue to face natural disasters, but the loss of life and the loss of properties are at the minimum level, because they continue to be ready for that. Unlike in countries where they are not prepared. Now suddenly, out of nowhere, tsunami struck Palu. Suddenly, out of nowhere, tsunami struck Aceh. Suddenly, out of nowhere, tsunami struck Phuket. Nobody could have prepared that. So that's why it is important for all of us to have knowledge, especially governments. Especially government, because governments are responsible to prepare, to have necessary preparedness, to have initiative to prevent disasters from taking place. Sometimes, we cannot anticipate what's going to happen. Even, let's say, for example, who could have predicted that Aceh, was being hit hard by tsunami? Who could have predicted that? Nobody could have predicted that. Even after Aceh, people say, oh, we are okay now, we are safe. Pop, suddenly Palu was being hit by tsunami again. And sometimes people forget natural disaster can take place at any time. If the government, if people are not prepared, then there'll be a tremendous loss of life, tremendous loss of properties, tremendous loss of resources. So that's why it is important to learn about disaster management. So single disaster approach rather than multi-disaster approach. So was what is taking place now, the scenario. And then lack of preparation, implementation of disaster management plan, lack of capacity, like department, first responder, communities, inadequate database and early warning system. As much as developed countries, they have all these sophisticated devices, they have all this sophisticated technology, they are still unable to predict what is going to happen. But at least they have the database, they have the early warning system. So they know if tsunami is coming, they can warn countries that are in that particular area to be more prepared. And that countries, they have to take the initiative. What happened after the international news organization or international news agencies, they remind and want the countries to be prepared. If the country is not being prepared, it's the same thing. There's no something is not going to change if countries are not able to take the preparation themselves, rather than waiting for other countries to come and help them. Absence of systematic studies, corporate sector, social responsibility, lack of clarity in disaster management, lack of mainstreaming of disaster management activities. This is also important. So scope of disaster management training program. Hazard specific, natural and man-made. So we have to continuously be prepared, making necessary training program to make sure that government is well prepared. Multi-sector, multi-level preparedness and prevention, emergency first responders. In Japan, they continue to have this kind of training, so that when it comes time to real disaster, people are well prepared. People are well prepared. So they have like every 3 months, they will undergo all this kind of training, so that people know what to do when the real disaster comes. So that's what happened when countries, like Japan and some other Western countries, they have all this kind of preparation, so that people know what to do when it comes time to a disaster. Community-based disaster risk management, community-based risk reduction. We have to look into that also, whether our community is prepared with this disaster risk management and risk reduction. Yes, government is always have all these agencies that are dealing with disaster management, but what about the community? Because community also has to take part in that. Multi-disaster construction practices, and then GIS, remote sensing technology. Now we have very advanced technology that could help us in terms of preparing for any kind of disaster. Need-based disaster management training. Do we have all this disaster management training in place? Sector-specific disaster management plan preparation, awareness, sensitization and capacity building training, to make people more sensitive, to make people more aware of the disaster. Sometimes the reason why so many people get caught up with the disaster is because you look at the situation in Palu, you look at the situation in Aceh, they know the water was coming to them, but they did not attempt to run away because they did not have any inclination that this is a serious disaster that is coming to them. People are still laughing, people, as if nothing bad is going to happen. And why? Because of this lack of awareness, lack of sensitivity, lack of capacity building training. So this is important, So that's why, again, I would always give an example of Japan, because Japan is at the forefront of this thing. Every single citizen knows what to do. Knows what to do. In America, when I was there, we also have this kind of training. Every time when there is a tornado siren blasting, then we know what to do. Now you have to find safe area to hide. So you don't wait until the actual disaster takes place. Local government continues to have this kind of training, capacity building training. So people are aware, people are sensitive, people are well prepared. So this is what we call preparedness level. And then training and capacity building, research and guidance in the area of disaster management, policy advocacy and expertise to government and department, preparation of disaster management plan, what kind of SOPs, what are the manuals, the guideline, developing a resource repository so that whenever people wanted to get information, they can go and get information. Linkage with training, academic research and other institutions, development of training modules, curriculum, and other materials. So type, level, and methods of disaster management training, induction, refreshment, skills up, gradation, orientation, training of trainer, at the state level, at the district level, at the field levels, whether using presentation like what I am doing now, discussion, videos, movies, clipping, role play, hands-on experience, simulation, mock drills. So this is also important for disaster management, especially along the line of coastal cities, climate change impact, unpredictable nature, quantum of rainfall, wind, velocity. So these are areas where local government, related agencies, they have to prepare to have all the information, because our nature is very unpredictable. Human nature is unpredictable. Suddenly when it is sunny day, suddenly rains come. So we really cannot predict, we really cannot anticipate the nature, what's going to take place. So we have to always be prepared, especially along the line of coastal cities. And then vulnerability variation, place and time across the country, requires spatial coping capacity in city management, specific study required micro level planning, deal with critical issues and provide practical solution. Center can be established across the country. Expert from a reputed institution or agency should be invited to come and share their expertise. Linkage across the country, serve as a resource base for all stakeholders. So, in terms of volunteers, capacity building of stakeholders, deputization of officers, R&D, documentation of best practices, knowledge management, training needs analysis, and feedback mechanism. These are all critical. Okay, so let me share with you my last slide. Then this is ICT for Smart Sustainable Asia Pacific. Even though the data that are being presented here, was kind of old, because like from 1900 to 2011, but we can see the trend is on the rise. So this is the trend of disasters that took place since 1900, and it is on the rise. So it is very scary. So that's why countries should be well prepared in terms of facing the disasters. And what is even unfortunate is that disasters affect everyone, but they impact poor and vulnerable the most. No, you can look at here. Low-income countries account for only 9% of the world disasters, but 48% of the fatalities. America, every year, continues to face disasters, whether tornado, whether hurricane, whether flood, fire, forest fire, but the fatalities are very small. But look at what happened to low-income countries. Only 9% of the world disasters, but 48%, half of the fatalities come from the low-income countries or developing countries or poor countries. And look at disaster impact until 2014. From 2005 until 2014. Look at the damages, 1.4 trillion. 1.7 billion people affected by the disaster. 0.7 million people killed by the disaster. So you can see, disaster is a very serious issue, causing loss of life, causing tremendous damage, and also people, not only life, but people who are affected by the disaster. And look at the financial damages. Number of disasters, total damage in billion. US, 443 billion losses. Indonesia, 11 billion. Where not only during tsunami, but also other disasters from 2005 until 2014. Vietnam. You look at Japan, 239 in terms of financial, but loss of life is very minimal because they continue to face every single year natural disasters. 62 number of disasters. China, 286. 212. Indonesia, 141 disasters took place between 2005 until 2014. So role of ICTs in emergencies, preparedness. Vital role, government develop disaster management policies, regulation, and legal framework development. Implementation of ICT project and capacity building. Communication is important. With people affected is critical. Now, in some areas in Shah Alam, KL, electric agencies, they are cutting off electricity for fear of safety. So people cannot charge their handphone. It's very difficult to communicate with these people because they are basically being cut off from communication line. So it is important, this particular aspect. Mitigation. What kind of mitigation is there? Early warning system. Establish evacuation centers. Advise people. Radio, mobile. We have to have all these facilities. We have to have all these initiatives to help and improve the mitigation of crisis. So, role of telecommunication, meteorological services, Earth exploration, satellite service, weather and climate prediction, amateur services, receiving and distributing, broadcasting, Earth observation satellite, GIS, global navigation satellite system, allowed to complement Earth observation, satellite communication, land observation system. So all kind of technologies and services are there to help countries prepare and manage crisis. So emergency telecommunication is an integral part of Telecommunication Development Bureau. implement activities related to telecommunication in disaster management and disaster risk reduction. So, disaster risk reduction focus on mitigation, preparedness aspect of emergency cycle. And then during disaster management, systematic process that aim to reduce the negative impact or consequences of adverse event. Climate change mitigation and adaptation, a response that seeks to reduce vulnerability of natural and human system to climate change effects. So what kind of action? Development, formulation of standard, deployment of telecommunication, human and institutional capacity building, forging stakeholder partnership, project design, and implementation. Okay. Let me check whether I have. Okay, one more. One more, Pak Wang, yeah?
Okay, Prof.
Okay, one more slide. This is also important. Disaster volunteering. Learn, prepare, and engage. Introduction, when disaster strikes, disaster response community, disaster response organization, call for action. So when disaster strikes, what should we do? Think about it. Have you or someone you know been impacted by disaster? There are many amenities and primary services that we often take for granted until they are done. So this is important. Sometimes, we don't really pay serious attention until, sometimes we live in a very comfortable life, and then suddenly when a flood comes across, the house is gone, the car is being submerged. So this lesson describes the most common type of disaster and how they affect people and community. What if this happened to you? So you should be asking that kind of question. The impact of disaster varies depending on the type of disaster or emergency and the services needed. So you should state the disasters that typically affect people, recognize the needs that arise from disasters, describe the effect the volunteers can have on relief and recovery. Devastation caused by disaster. Although many disasters never make the news, disasters occur more often than we might think. A few make global headline because of their destructive powers and devastation, like earthquake in Nepal, 2015, caused devastation across a wide area. Devastation caused by disaster. You can see on April 25th, 2015, a violent earthquake struck Nepal. It was the region's worst quake in more than 80 years, with a magnitude of 7.8 scale. Weeks later, a 7.3 magnitude aftershock. 9,000 people were killed in Nepal. 20,000 were injured. 800,000 homes were damaged or destroyed. And you can see here, according to the United Nations report, nearly 3 million survivors still required urgent help months after the quakes. Many were in mountainous, hard to reach areas. Water systems were ruined. We are all familiar with many types of disasters. Some can be predicted while others occur without warning. But in either case, the loss and trauma can be very significant. While fire, houses fire occur frequently in North America. Some are more common, some disasters can be predicted, some cannot be predicted. So which of the following are considered common disasters? Flood, wildfires, tornadoes, robberies. A, B, C. These are all common to all of us. That's why I said people who live in this part of the region, we continue to face flood, we continue to face wildfires, we continue to face tornadoes, typhoons. How lives are affected. Following a disaster, personal loss and destruction can be very devastating. The basic routines of life can be transformed into uncertainty. This example shows challenges people might face after a disaster. This is very serious. A lot of disasters. These are cases that are taking place. How can I find members of my extended family? Especially during earthquake, during flooding, during tsunami. So this is the kind of question. They were looking for family members. I'm sure you know this because in Aceh, a lot of stories were like this. They were looking for family members. And then how will I get food and water for my children? It's also a critical thing. And how can I replace important personal documents, such as those I need to access my bank account or apply for government help? Because sometimes your identification is lost. Your key documents are lost. So how do you find that? How do you replace that? For older people, how do I replace medical supplies I depend on? So these are the kind of questions that people always have to face when they are struck with disasters. Consequences of disaster. When entire communities are stricken, the impact can be enormous. Civil services may be interrupted with power down, road blocks, shortage of drinking water, personal loss, stress. Businesses may be shut down, jobs lost, families and communities. Recovery from disaster can take weeks, months, years sometimes. So what are some of the impact on people? Loss of life, power outage, loss of possession. How prepared are you? This is the key question. How prepared are we? Emergencies happen every day around the world, but most people are not properly prepared. Even in America, US government estimates about 20 to 40% of Americans have put in place some form of preparation for an emergency situation. But for others, they are not well prepared. Only 20 to 40% they are well prepared. So you look at scenario here. It is late on Friday afternoon. Dangerous storm is battering your region. You made it home safely, but the weather is deteriorating rapidly and several road closings have been announced. Your spouse is working in another city and cannot get home using public transportation as usual. You are concerned about your elderly parents who live 2 miles from your home. Road conditions are dangerous. Local officials have warned against traveling except to move to higher ground. Should you try to travel to help your spouse get back to home, or you stay home? Now, these are all scenarios that are likely to take place when we are faced with this kind of situation. So what would you do? Would you be prepared in similar situation? So basic items to have in case of disaster or emergency. Water, 4 liters per person per day. 3-day supply for evacuation. 2-week supply for home. Food, non-perishable, easy to prepare item. 3-day supply. Flashlight, battery powered or hand crank radio. Extra batteries. First aid kits, medication, 7-day supply and medical item. Maps of your area, noting the location of emergency services, hospital, police, shelters, and any official evacuation routes. Multi-purpose tool, sanitation and personal hygiene item, copies of personal document, medication list, pertinent medical information, proof of address, home, passport, birth certificate, insurance policies, etc. Cell phone with chargers, family and emergency contact information, a written list of phone numbers, addresses, etc. Extra cash, emergency blanket. So these are all necessary items during disaster. Now, how prepared are we? This is the checklist. Check your knowledge. So summary, the impact of disaster on families, communities, and even entire nation can be very devastating. So following small, people need food, clothing, shelter, drinking water. Some common consequences of disaster include closed road, power outage, closed or destroyed businesses, blood shortage, lost job. Often people are not ready for emergency. Be prepared by having basic essential item on hand and by arranging emergency contact and procedures in advance. Disaster response community. Focus on local actors. Change can be hard when a crisis hit. Who is there first? It is their home, their present, and will affect their future. When a crisis hit, local actors often dig with their bare hand, while international actors bring needed resources. But it is not enough. Well, we all share the same role. We all reach each other in a heartbeat. We learn from each other. Think maybe advance where it starts. What you will learn. Disaster preparedness and response are community effort. The lesson emphasizes the power of community, agencies, organizations, and individuals coming together in times of need. So who might arrive first in times of disaster? Group who respond first may include police, fire, local government, army personnel, and other agencies involved in emergency response. In other cases, local civilian may intervene before formally trained first responders arrive. Untrained responders should take care not to impact the efforts of professional responders or highly trained volunteers. Additionally, civilians should be careful not to put themselves or others in danger during their effort. So what happened after? Collaborative response. Following a disaster, community groups, local agencies collaborate. Here are some examples. Businesses might be able to provide financial or assistance to others, employee volunteerism. Individual NGOs are often available to help on short notice. Facilities for shelter may be offered by a variety of organizations. Disaster strike. Imagine a massive flood occurs in your community and destroy 170 homes. Hundreds are in need of assistance. This activity allows you to explore how various community resources come together. So these are examples. individual volunteer, neighborhood association, business, NGOs, government, faith-based organization, what they can do to help the community. Community respond by distributing water, cleaning supplies, collecting, distributing diapers, food, other essential items, providing meals, assisting in shelter, providing civic protection and security, coordinating, providing facilities, information, donating money, donating needed supplies, supporting employees. The skill you use every day are needed after a disaster. So you can see where people volunteers to help their communities. Help in action. So communities should be coming together to help local communities when the community is facing crisis. And disaster response organization. Care, Medical Corps, International Medicine Sans Frontiers, Save the Children. These are all international organizations that are dealing with volunteerism. World Food Program, then largest humanitarian network in the world, IFRC, the National Federation of Red Cross, Red Crescent Societies. Cooperation and disaster responses. So these are all examples how volunteers have helped a lot of countries, India, Ecuador, Taiwan, Japan. These are all testimonials of volunteers. Okay. Okay, Pak Wang.
Okay, thank you very much, Prof. Martadha. Very insightful. Students who will learn about many things about disaster management. We know that Japan is one of the countries that already successful in disaster management, and Indonesia and also Malaysia still need learn more to do the disaster management. And from Prof. Martadha, we also got many knowledge and information step by step how to do the disaster management. And we still have limited time. This is question and answer session. Students, any questions? Baskoro, you already text me that you will learn. Okay, Mas Baskoro, please.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Awang, and good afternoon, Prof. Martadha.
Yeah, afternoon.
Prof, I have a simple question about disaster management during the COVID-19. For actually, the world faces COVID-19 almost 2 years, and Malaysia and also Indonesia have some cases. And my question is, how Malaysia faces the disaster management during the COVID-19? Is Malaysia has trouble during the COVID-19 or yeah? Thank you, Prof.
Okay, thank you,
Thank
Mas
you.
Bagaskoro. Yeah, I think every country in the world, they get caught by surprise when the pandemic took place because nobody knows how to handle, especially developing countries, like Malaysia, Indonesia, smaller countries, poor countries. We do not know how to deal with this, widespread crisis. And even Western world, also have a lot of problem dealing with this crisis. You look at America. In the beginning, there were a lot of anger and hatred towards Trump because the initiative taken by the Trump government was not very good. He acted as if the pandemic was not very serious. So he did not close down all activities. He allowed people to run businesses. He allowed people to not wearing masks, and he himself was not wearing masks at that time, until the situation becoming very worse. So if you were to look at other countries, every country struggle to manage the crisis. Every country had a lot of problems. Even in Malaysia, in the beginning, we also had a lot of problems. We do not know how to handle that. So the initial step was we stop all activities. We applied MCO, movement restriction order. No movement from all people. Nobody cannot go out from their own area, 5 kilometers from their own area. Nobody, and then it was, we also are having curfews. Nobody could go out after 8 p.m. Between 6 to 8, 6 a.m. until 8 p.m. Those are the time where people can, go out from their home, do some kind of exercises, activity, but in limited spaces. But after that, no. So there was strict control of the movement of people. And then there was time where people felt that it was not necessary. So government had to lessen the restriction, allow at least limited movement of people. So limited movement restriction was being enforced in our country. But suddenly the cases arise. So government had to cancel the minimum restriction, go back to full restriction of movement. So that's why we have first MCO, second MCO, third MCO, fourth MCO, movement control order. And finally, now, after some time, government realizes that, we cannot close our economic activities. We cannot stop people from going out. So now government has already declared that COVID-19 is an endemic, no longer a pandemic. When it is an endemic, so you have to utilize precaution. For example, wearing masks, physical distancing, and we have software called MySejahtera, where you have to key in your MySejahtera application, and vaccination. All people are compulsory to take vaccination. And now, we are into the second stage where government is asking people to take a booster shot. Apart from the second vaccination, now they called it a booster shot, where people have to take that also as a precaution to make sure people are being protected from the new kind of variants. Delta variant, so many Omicron variant now is also wreaking havoc to a lot of countries. But government has realized that to enforce movement control is something that will be bad for the country. Economically is bad, socially is bad. So that's why government has taken away with all this restriction, and people can move freely. But because it is an endemic, so now people have to obey a lot of protocols, a lot of SOPs, like wearing masks in public, limited physical distancing, or if you are not fully vaccinated, you cannot travel by plane, or you cannot travel by public transport, and you cannot do a lot of things. You cannot go shopping, if you don't have full vaccination. So for those who do not have full vaccination, their movement is very restricted. And why? Because government wanted to make sure that everybody is safe. So if you were to ask me whether the policies of the government was very successful, I said initially it was not. But every country in the world was like that. I'm sure the same thing in Indonesia. The same thing in Indonesia. Government did not know how to handle this kind of crisis. No countries in the world know how to handle this kind of crisis because it was so sudden and it was so severe. So that's why, whenever we are talking about disaster preparedness earlier, it would be very difficult to prepare this kind of disaster because this is something that you don't see with your own eyes. The virus is not something that you can see. Disasters, other disasters you can see. Tornadoes, earthquake, wildfire, forest fire, flood, you can see. But virus you cannot see. So what are the mechanisms for you to make sure that you are prepared? The SOPs. This is why we called it the new norms. The new norm. These new norms will become the norm of society in the future, where you are wearing masks in the public, where you cannot salam anymore. When you greet with people, you cannot salam anymore because it's dangerous. Virus can be infected because you never know whether the person that you are greeting is safe or not. So the new norms will take place, wearing masks, physical distancing, all other things. So there is no more ordinary things like what we used to do. So my short answer would be, we cannot fault every country that had failures in terms of managing the COVID. We cannot blame them because no countries in the world know how to handle. Even America had a lot of problems. Even Canada, they limited the freedom, and then they open again. Australia and then New Zealand, for example, one time it was a very exemplary country. People were praising the leaders of New Zealand, but suddenly they closed down again the border. They restricted the movement of people in the country. So no country in the world knows how to deal with this in the beginning. So slowly and steadily we learn, we share information, we trade information. So now things are slowly getting back to normal. So my answer would be, it is very difficult and you cannot finger point any leaders in any country for failure to manage the crisis because nobody knows how to manage the crisis.
Okay, enough, Mas Baskoro.
Okay, enough. Thank you, Prof. Martadha, for the
Okay.
explanation.
Welcome.
Okay, second questions, Prof, from chat room. Question from Kumesa. He asked about, he explained that in Indonesia already has some institutions that has authority to handle the disaster management, but it is not quite enough to do the authority. And he asked, the question is, how about give the educations to the society by use the local wisdom? Is it proper enough, Prof?
Yeah, I think sometimes, like I said earlier, it is not good to finger point the authorities. It is also not good to blame the authorities because every, like my presentation earlier, everybody should have a role in this disaster management preparedness. Education is one thing. University, it's very good. Pak Awang, UMY is offering this kind of course because it will allow students to have a very complete understanding of what disaster is about, how to manage the disaster, how to prepare the disaster, what they should have done in order to mitigate the crisis whenever they are facing with the disaster. And when they become the authority one day, and then when they are involved in NGOs or when they become the local authority, they should take active role, because only people who have experienced disaster knows how to handle disaster. For those who have not experienced the crisis, for those who have not even faced the crisis, they might not even have the slightest idea what they are talking about. For those who have gone through the experiences, they know what to do. So sometimes, yeah, it's easier, like yesterday I was talking, I'm a political commentarist. One news organization called me up, telling me, the failure of government agencies to respond to this crisis in Malaysia. I did not want to comment because I said, it is easy to finger point agencies at this moment of crisis, but it is not the way to do. Because when it comes times to face the crisis, when you are dealing with crisis, every agency, every authority, everybody, local government, NGOs, they should come together and coordinate the effort of helping the people who are in need of help. Not to finger pointing people, not to blame agencies, because that's not the right thing to do. The right thing to do at the moment of crisis is to help, coordinate, help those who are in need. Whether the initiative is from the local government, whether the initiative is from the NGOs, whether the initiative is from individuals or from societies or from government agencies, it does not matter. As long as every actor should come together, work hand in hand to manage and mitigate the crisis. So, it is easy to blame the authorities, but when we are facing with crisis, the blaming game should be put aside. But that does not mean that agencies, they are responsible to prepare for the disaster. No, they should not just take their hands off like that. They should take a lot of initiative. Society should be pressuring them. Agencies should be pressuring them to have disaster preparedness training program, to implement training program, to educate people. Besides agencies, universities also have to play a role, schools have to play a role, NGOs have to play a role. So for me, everybody should play a role in preparing for a disaster. So disaster preparedness is something that everybody should be familiar with, everybody should be concerned about.
Thank you very much, Prof, for your explanations. And also, okay, Mas Gembira already satisfied with your answer, Prof. Unfortunately, Prof, several
Yeah.
students will have another lecturers.
Okay, no
10 minutes
problem.
more. So that was the last questions, and I hope this is not the last our meetings. Maybe
Yeah.
next year we will
Inshallah.
have, inshallah, we have
Inshallah.
another visiting professor, and we are very happy. We are very glad to get knowledge from you, Prof. Martadha.
Thank you, Pak.
And thank you very much on behalf of
Yeah.
IGOV and
Thank you for inviting me, Pak. And also UMY for inviting me to share some of the knowledge, in terms of helping the student, especially the student. They should be able to be prepared and have knowledge about this disaster preparedness.
Okay. Okay, thank you, Prof. And
Thank you.
how about the PowerPoint, Prof? Can we get the PowerPoint?
Yeah, I will distribute to Ibu
Adiba, to Adiba.
Yeah, Adibah. Yes,
Okay.
yes, yeah.
Okay, thank you. And this
Thank
is
you, Pak.
thank you very much, Prof. Martadha and
Okay, thank you.
students. This is the end of our visiting lectures. And Mbak Adiba? Mbak Adiba?
Yeah.
Okay.
Then, Well, thank you, Prof. Martadha, for insightful information regarding disaster preparedness. Yeah, I heard that Malaysia also has flood there. So I hope everyone will be safe and healthy. Also in Indonesia, there are a lot of natural disasters. There are earthquakes. Or last 2 weeks, there's an eruption from Semeru. It makes us need to know but how is the disaster preparedness itself. So thank you once again, Prof. Martadha. But before we close the session, let's have the last photo session because this is our last meeting. So guys, I hope you turn your camera on, everyone, so we can see your face clearly. Maybe do you want to touch up first? You want to wear lipstick for the girls? That's okay. I give you time. Let's turn your camera on. All right. So I'm going to count to 3. 1, 2, 3. Once again. 1, 2, 3. Okay. Thank you guys for attending this session. I hope you guys learned something, a lot of things from this session. I'm going to close by reciting Alhamdulillah together. Alhamdulillah. Dan billahi taufik walhidayah. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. See you everyone.
Thank you. Assalamualaikum.
Thank you Prof. Marta. Thank you Pak Awang. I go for. Can you stay still at the room? I'm going to announce several matters.
Oke.
Oke, Mbak.
Siap, Mbak.
Siap.
Oke.
For those who are stay at one room, you can just join with other friends so we can talk because I want to hear every one of you.
Sini. Gimana saya tahu? Emang apa dipeributkan? Oh ini masih on mic ini cuy.
Ada di SH semua ya?
Kita di gedung D, Mbak.
Oh di gedung D. Acara apa?
Nggak ada acara apa-apa.
Oh di American Corner.
Ya betul. Kita mau ke kantin bentar lagi, Mbak.
Okay. So do you play Wii game there?
Yes, actually we always be here.
Memang sih itu sebenarnya Amkor tuh tempat paling asik sih buat ala-ala nongkrong ala-ala gitu.
Iya Mbak, ini
You can do karaoke juga kan di sana.
Ya.
Kalau mau nyanyi-nyanyi
Tidur juga enak Mbak di sini, Mbak.
Tidur juga. Okay, is everyone here?
Yes.
Siapa aja? 12 orang sama aja ya? I need to look at your attendance.
Apa?
Kalian soft skill-nya kemarin apa ya?
Itu yang sama Pak Riza itu loh, Mbak. Apa ya lupa saya juga.
Oke.
Mbak ini masih live di YouTube ya?